Tonight we begin with a confrontation that Western intelligence officials had tracked, warned about, and dreaded for months. A confrontation that unfolded not over diplomatic channels spanning weeks, but in a matter of hours. Hours that rewrote the rules of this conflict. Hours that demonstrated Ukraine's defiance in the starkest possible terms. Hours that left the Kremlin scrambling to understand what just happened. What Vladimir Putin did this morning was issue a warning, a direct, explicit warning to the United States and the United Kingdom about what he called inevitable consequences for their continued support of Ukraine. And when that warning was broadcast, Ukraine did not hesitate. They did not wait for permission. They did not consult with nervous allies. They did not flinch. They responded with speed, with precision, and with a strike that crossed every red line Putin had ever drawn. Within hours of Putin's televised threat, Ukraine answered. And tonight the world is watching to see what comes next. For several months now, there had been rumblings, not official diplomatic protests, not formal ultimatums delivered through ambassadors, just rumblings that Vladimir Putin was preparing something provocative. Putin has been threatening, yes, but he has been methodical in his threatening. His warnings have followed a certain cadence, a predictability, almost a choreography that Western analysts had learned to decode. Russia threatens, the West ignores, Ukraine acts, Russia threatens again. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and London this week was that the choreography changed. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian state media, military communications, and diplomatic back channels know the indicators. The sudden increase in nuclear rhetoric on Russian television, the repositioning of strategic assets without corresponding exercises, the recall of certain diplomatic personnel for consultations, the sudden coordination between Moscow and its allies in Belarus and Iran. All of that shifted into high gear over the past 72 hours. And whenever Vladimir Putin accelerates his messaging, it means he is about to do something designed to get attention. The question was, whose attention? Was this performance meant for domestic consumption, another attempt to rally Russian public opinion behind a war that has cost far more than promised? Was this meant for European capitals, an effort to fracture the coalition supporting Ukraine before another round of aid packages? Or was this meant for Washington and London specifically, a direct challenge to the two nations Putin blames most for prolonging this conflict? Tonight we got our answer. It was all three. Early this morning, Russian state television interrupted regular programming with what was announced as an important address from the President of the Russian Federation. Vladimir Putin, seated behind his characteristic long table, looked directly into the camera and delivered what can only be described as a direct threat to the United States and the United Kingdom. He accused both nations of crossing into direct military confrontation with Russia. He claimed, without providing evidence, that American and British personnel were actively participating in targeting decisions that resulted in strikes on Russian territory. And then he said the words that made every intelligence officer in the Western world reach for their phones. There will be consequences, not warnings, not diplomatic notes, consequences, and those consequences will be felt not only by those who pull the trigger but by those who load the weapon. These are the kinds of statements that Russia only makes when they are signaling something very specific. An imminent escalation, a major diplomatic rupture, or preparation for actions that would have previously been considered off-limits. NATO observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Putin was changing the rules of engagement. And when a nuclear-armed autocrat changes the rules of engagement without warning, even by the smallest degree, every capital in the Western alliance goes on high alert. The Pentagon raised its threat assessment level. British intelligence activated additional monitoring protocols. And in Kiev, President Zelensky convened an emergency meeting of his National Security Council. The question hanging over all of them, what was Putin actually planning to do? The answer came faster than anyone expected. But it didn't come from Moscow. It came from Ukraine. The advisory issued by the State Department tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior official after classified briefing described Putin's warning as inflammatory, deliberately escalatory, and perhaps most importantly, designed to create paralysis in Western decision-making at a critical moment. But intimidation only works if the target freezes. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most audacious military operations we've seen since the full-scale invasion began. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of Putin's televised threat, Ukraine launched a massive coordinated strike deep into Russian territory using long-range missiles, advanced drones, and capabilities that directly crossed the red lines Putin has been drawing for years. These weren't the limited, symbolic strikes on border regions we've seen before. These were strategic attacks on targets that Russia had explicitly warned would trigger severe retaliation, military installations, logistical hubs and infrastructure that Moscow had designated as off-limits. Ukraine used weapons that Russia had specifically named. Ukraine struck targets that Russia had specifically threatened to defend. Ukraine did exactly what Putin warned against, and they did it within hours of his warning. The message was unmistakable: your red lines mean nothing to us. Tonight, Ukrainian military officials confirmed that they launched precision strikes on 23 separate targets across multiple Russian regions, including a military airfield in Kursk Oblast that had recently been reinforced with additional aircraft and personnel for what analysts believe was preparation for renewed bombing campaigns against Ukrainian cities. Ukraine struck before those aircraft could be used. They hit fuel storage facilities that supply Russian military aviation. They hit ammunition depots that had been restocked with Iranian-supplied munitions. They hit command and control centers that coordinate drone attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. They hit air defense installations that Russia had positioned to protect exactly these kinds of targets. In other words, Ukraine targeted the offensive capability that Russia was building up. The infrastructure that would have made the next wave of attacks on Ukrainian civilians possible. This is what made Western officials so anxious about Putin's warning this morning. Putin's threat wasn't just rhetoric, it was preparation. Russia was clearly planning something significant, and Putin's warning was designed to deter interference. It represented the kind of move that could have resulted in devastating attacks on Ukrainian population centers if left unchallenged. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with overwhelming force. Not recklessly, not emotionally, but with surgical precision. They didn't strike civilian areas in Russia. They didn't target population centers. They hit military assets. They hit offensive capabilities. They hit the weapons that would have been used against Ukrainian families. Military analysts speaking to MSNBC tonight described Ukraine's targeting as textbook proportional response with strategic intent. One former NATO commander called it exactly the kind of operation that demonstrates both capability and restraint. That combination, capability and restraint, is precisely what makes Ukraine's position so strong. They proved they can strike deep into Russia, and they proved they will only strike legitimate military targets. That distinction matters enormously in the court of international opinion. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence analysts now believe that Putin's warning this morning was designed to test the resolve of Western capitals after months of political uncertainty surrounding the US election. Putin wanted to see whether Washington would pressure Ukraine to stand down. He wanted to see whether London would distance itself from Ukrainian operations. He wanted to see whether the threat of escalation would create hesitation, delay, or division among Ukraine's allies. But instead, the opposite happened. Neither Washington nor London pressured Ukraine to hold back. They issued a joint statement supporting Ukraine's right to self-defense that was so unequivocal, so direct, that Russian state media spent hours trying to spin it as something other than what it clearly was: complete rejection of Putin's ultimatum. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily. But today, Ukraine and its allies did. Defense officials speaking with NBC News under anonymity described Putin's warning as coercive diplomacy, a way to use threats to achieve strategic objectives without actually following through. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both willing and able to call that bluff. Their strikes were not only precise, they were timed so strategically that Russian air defenses were overwhelmed before they could respond effectively. That timing matters because it shows intelligence coordination. It shows that Ukraine is not operating in isolation. They are not guessing where Russian assets are located. They know. And that knowledge comes from the very Western support that Putin was threatening this morning. In other words, Putin threatened the US and UK for providing intelligence support to Ukraine. And within hours, Ukraine demonstrated exactly why that support is so effective. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian Air Force units carried out strikes on 3 separate Russian military airfields, forcing the Russian Air Force to relocate dozens of aircraft away from the front lines. Ukrainian ground-launched missiles targeted railway infrastructure that had been used in the last 2 weeks to transport North Korean ammunition to frontline Russian units. Ukrainian naval drones operating in the Black Sea reportedly struck a Russian vessel that had been involved in launching cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities just days earlier. Ukrainian special operations forces conducted sabotage operations against fuel pipelines that supply Russian military operations in occupied territories. This wasn't just retaliation. This wasn't just defense. This was strategic degradation. This was systematic dismantling of Russian offensive capability. And systematic dismantling is the one thing Russia has struggled to prevent since this war began. For every threat Putin has issued, Ukraine has countered with something that makes his threats less credible. For every red line Putin has drawn, Ukraine has demonstrated that crossing it produces no catastrophic consequences. For every ultimatum Putin has delivered, Ukraine has shown that ultimatums are not the same as capability. And tonight that pattern continued. Remember, Vladimir Putin thought his red lines would hold. He thought the threat of escalation would paralyze Western decision-makers. He thought Ukraine would be too afraid to strike deep into Russian territory. He thought the US and UK would pressure Kiev to exercise restraint. But tonight the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is striking deeper into Russia than ever before. Western support is continuing without interruption. And Putin's threats are being answered not with fear, but with action. This is not the war Vladimir Putin planned. This is not the war he promised the Russian people. This is not the war he expected to be fighting 3 years after his special military operation was supposed to have ended in 3 days. And every time he issues a warning, every time he draws a red line, every time he threatens consequences, Ukraine reminds him that he is not in control. Ukraine is. What makes this moment so volatile and so unpredictable is that Putin's warning happened at a time when he is under extraordinary internal pressure. Russian military bloggers want more aggressive action against Western targets. Russian oligarchs want an end to the war that has destroyed their international standing. Russian generals want resources that are being consumed faster than they can be replaced. Russian families want their sons and husbands to come home alive. Putin is balancing these conflicting demands while simultaneously trying to project strength to the outside world. And when leaders in that position make dramatic public threats, they're not doing it from a position of confidence. They're doing it from desperation. They're doing it because their other options have failed. Putin's warning this morning was not a sign of strength. It was a sign that after 3 years of war, after hundreds of thousands of casualties, after sanctions that have crippled the Russian economy, Vladimir Putin still does not have a path to victory. And when autocrats feel cornered, they become dangerous. Not because they are strong, but because they have nothing left to lose by escalating. That's what makes the next few days so critical. The State Department's response now circulating through every diplomatic channel in the world, was designed to signal that the United States is not intimidated by Putin's threats. Officials said plainly that Russia's warning was inconsistent with the behavior expected of a responsible nuclear power. That is diplomatic language for, "We see your bluff and we're not folding." You don't usually hear that tone from the State Department unless something genuinely serious is at stake. The British Foreign Office was equally direct. In a statement released within hours of Putin's address, London called Russia's threats irresponsible and reaffirmed its unwavering commitment to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes. Behind the scenes, we're told that emergency consultations are taking place between Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin. The agenda: what happens if Putin actually follows through on his threats? The conclusion so far: Russia lacks the capability to do what Putin is implying without triggering consequences that would be catastrophic for Russia itself. In other words, Western officials believe Putin is bluffing, and Ukraine's response today was designed to call that bluff in the most visible way possible. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a defiant, resolute speech tonight. He said, "We heard the threats from Moscow this morning. We answered them this afternoon. That is how Ukraine responds to intimidation." He said, "Every weapon they aim at our cities, we will destroy before it can be fired. Every threat they make, we will meet with action, not words." And he said, "Putin wants the world to be afraid, but it is Putin who should be afraid, because every day Ukraine grows stronger, every day our allies stand with us, and every day Russia's position grows weaker." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands that words have consequences, and who chose his words very carefully tonight. Zelensky was speaking not only to Ukraine. He was speaking to Moscow. And his message was clear: your threats do not scare us. Here's what makes the situation even more dangerous. Putin's warning this morning wasn't isolated. Along with his televised address, Russian military forces conducted what they called nuclear readiness exercises near the Ukrainian border. Russian diplomatic officials delivered formal protest notes to US and British embassies in Moscow. Russian state media began running segments describing potential targets in NATO countries. Russian cyber units increased their activity against Western infrastructure networks. All of this happened within the same 24-hour period. When Putin coordinates multiple actions simultaneously, it means something larger is underway. It means this isn't just rhetoric. It means Moscow is preparing for something, or wants the world to believe it is. The question Western officials are asking tonight: is this preparation for escalation or preparation for negotiation? Is Putin trying to raise the stakes before making new demands? Or is he genuinely considering actions that could bring Russia into direct conflict with NATO? No one knows for certain. And that uncertainty is exactly what Putin wants. Strategic analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing a major new offensive in Ukraine and using the threat of escalation to deter Western interference. Another is that Putin is attempting to create conditions for negotiations by demonstrating willingness to escalate, a classic coercive diplomacy tactic. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is genuinely considering strikes on Western interests or territory, either directly or through proxies. But today, Ukraine took the initiative. They didn't wait to see what Putin would do next. They didn't defer to anxious allies counseling patience. They didn't give Putin time to execute whatever he was planning. They struck first. And by striking first, they demonstrated that Ukraine will not be intimidated into passivity. They will not wait for permission. They will not allow Russia to set the tempo of this conflict. Ukraine is fighting on its own terms. And tonight, those terms included crossing every red line Vladimir Putin has ever drawn. What we're watching now is a test of credibility. Putin wants to see whether his threats can influence Western behavior. Ukraine wants to show that Russian threats are empty. Washington wants to prevent this conflict from spiraling into direct NATO involvement. And Moscow wants to avoid consequences for actions it cannot control. All of these objectives are in direct tension. And tonight that tension is reaching a critical point. The next 72 hours will determine whether Putin's threats were bluster or whether something more dangerous is coming. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian military activity around the clock. They say there are no immediate signs of Russian nuclear movements, a crucial indicator that Putin's rhetoric has not yet translated into action. They say Russian conventional forces are struggling to respond to today's Ukrainian strikes, with damage assessments still ongoing at multiple sites. And they say Putin's decision to issue such a direct warning is likely part of a broader strategy intended to create fear and division within the Western alliance. But Ukraine is not cowering. In fact, Ukraine is pressing forward. Their response today, swift, devastating, and precisely targeted, sent a message to Putin that threats only strengthen Ukrainian resolve. And it sent a message to Washington and London that their support is being used to maximum effect. That Ukraine is not a passive recipient of Western aid. Ukraine is an active partner in degrading Russian military capability. And that partnership is producing results that matter. As the night continues, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with this morning's warning. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was decisive. It demonstrated capability that Russia cannot ignore. It showed resolve that Russia cannot break. And it sent a signal that Russia's red lines are not obstacles, they are challenges to be overcome. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the coming days. If he backs down, this moment will be remembered as another failed attempt at coercion. If he escalates further, Ukraine and the West have already demonstrated they are ready. They have shown they will not be intimidated. They have shown they will not be paralyzed. They have shown they will respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, Vladimir Putin appears to be uncertain. The Kremlin is quiet. Too quiet. And when Putin is quiet after issuing threats, it means he is recalculating. It means he is processing the fact that his ultimatum was answered not with fear, but with fire. Because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he should have learned 3 years ago. Ukraine does not back down. Western support does not waver under pressure. And Russian red lines are made of nothing but words. This story is far from over. But tonight one thing is absolutely clear. Putin threatened consequences. Ukraine delivered them instead. And the world is watching to see what comes next. And we will be here, covering every development, as this extraordinary story continues to unfold.